Think about the last time you made a financial decision you later regretted. Not a big one, just a quiet one. Maybe you spent money you didn't really have. Maybe you pulled back when something inside you knew you shouldn't. Maybe you said yes because saying no felt like too much to explain. Or maybe you said no to something that actually mattered to you and told yourself it was the responsible choice. And afterward, you constructed a reason. I was tired. I deserved it. It wasn't that much. Next time will be different. But here's the thing worth sitting with. What if that decision had nothing to do with the moment? What if it was older than that? Much older. Most of us have tried to fix our relationship with money at some point. We track the spending. We write the budget. We make the promise to ourselves that this time, something will actually change. And sometimes it does. For a while, but then the pattern comes back, not dramatically, just quietly, the way it always does. Familiar, almost comfortable in how predictable it is. And we turn it inward. We call it weakness, poor discipline. A flaw we can't seem to correct no matter how many times we try. But discipline was never really the issue, because the pattern you keep returning to, the one that follows you across different jobs, different income levels, different versions of your life. It didn't start with you. It was already there when you arrived. Passed down without ceremony, without anyone intending it, by the people who raised you, in a home you didn't choose. During years you were too young to question anything you were absorbing. You inherited it. And the unsettling part is this. Most people never see it. Not because they're not looking, but because inherited patterns don't announce themselves. They don't feel like patterns at all. They feel like personalities, like instinct, like just the kind of person you are with money. What we're really talking about here isn't budgeting. It's not investing strategy or financial literacy or any of the things that usually fill this kind of conversation. It's something quieter than all of that. It's the emotional architecture around money that was built inside you before you could read, before you understood what a dollar actually meant, before you had any framework to question what you were witnessing, the way money was talked about in your house, or wasn't talked about, the way financial stress moved through the rooms, whether it was spoken or swallowed, whether it brought people together or sent them into separate silences, the way spending felt sometimes like love, and saving felt sometimes like fear, the way certain numbers were whispered, and certain conversations never happened at all. All of that became part of you, not through a lesson, not through a conversation anyone planned, just through presence, through years of quietly watching, feeling, and absorbing a reality that nobody told you wasn't universal. There's a version of this that looks like anxiety, someone who earns more than they ever expected to earn, more than their parents earned, more than anyone in their family thought was possible. And still, they don't feel okay, not financially anxious in an obvious way, just unsettled, like waiting for something to go wrong, like the stability is real, but the feeling of stability never quite arrives. They didn't construct that feeling consciously. They inherited it from a kitchen table where the atmosphere changed when bills arrived, from a parent who worked constantly and still seemed afraid, from the specific kind of quiet that fills a house when money is the thing nobody is talking about but everyone is thinking. The income changed, the feeling didn't. And then there's the opposite. Someone with extraordinary control over every financial detail, every dollar tracked, every risk assessed, every contingency considered. On the surface, that looks like discipline. But sometimes it isn't discipline at all. Sometimes it's fear with better posture. A nervous system that learned early that safety is fragile, that security can disappear without warning, that the only reliable response is control, total, exhausting, relentless control. And here's what's interesting about those two people. They look nothing alike. One spends to outrun a feeling, one saves to contain one. But underneath the behavior, they're responding to the same inheritance, the same wordless education, the same emotional map drawn in childhood that has been quietly directing their financial life ever since. This is where most financial thinking misses something important. It treats money as math, and the math is real. It matters. The principles of earning and saving and investing are genuinely sound, but math lives in the rational mind. The pattern lives somewhere the rational mind doesn't always reach. It lives in the body, in the reflexive feeling that arrives before a financial decision fully forms, in the emotional residue of years spent inside a particular financial reality during the years when everything felt permanent and normal and simply true. Nobody taught you these patterns directly. Nobody explained the family's complicated relationship with money. Nobody named what the fear was, or where it came from, or why certain conversations always ended the same way. But you learned, because children don't just observe behavior. They absorb the emotional truth underneath it. The thing beneath the words, the feeling beneath the silence. You noticed what changed in the room when certain subjects came up. You felt what money meant when there was enough of it, and what it meant when there wasn't. You saw whether success was something people in your world spoke about openly, or carefully, or not at all. You built a map from all of it, not a conscious one, not one you designed or chose or could have refused. A map of what money means emotionally, what it signals about a person, what having it says about you, what not having it says about you. And you have been using that map ever since. In every financial decision, every avoidance, every justification, every pattern you've tried to change and found yourself returning to, the territory of your life has shifted completely. The map hasn't. There's a term in behavioral psychology called emotional inheritance. It doesn't appear often in financial conversations, but it probably should. The idea is simply this. Emotional patterns don't stay contained within a single life. They move through families, through generations, not through DNA, but through the atmosphere, through what gets modeled and what gets avoided, through the particular emotional texture of a household that children absorb before they have language for any of it. Research in family psychology has found that specific financial behaviors, the tendency to avoid risk, to spend impulsively, to keep money secret, even patterns of generosity, repeat across generations with a consistency that has very little to do with conscious choice. They repeat because the emotional logic underneath them feels like reality. It doesn't feel like a pattern someone else developed and handed to you. It feels like common sense. It feels like you, and it doesn't stay quietly in the background. These patterns get activated constantly, by proximity to other people's lives, by what we see and compare ourselves to, by the subtle, relentless pressure of existing in a world where everyone's financial life is visible, and everyone's financial anxiety is private. A generation ago, comparison had natural limits. Your neighborhood, your colleagues, the people you could actually see. Now, it's everywhere, and it never stops. The psychological research on this is worth sitting with. A landmark study from Princeton found that beyond a certain income level, earning more money contributed very little to daily emotional well-being. But what continued to affect people, deeply and consistently, was where they perceived themselves relative to others, not what they had compared to. This is where inherited patterns become genuinely costly. Because if you grew up in a home where your financial position was connected to your worth as a person, where having less carried a quiet shame, or having more felt like something that needed to be proven, then social comparison doesn't just produce ordinary discomfort. It reaches back. It pulls forward the emotional logic from years ago. The part of you that is absorbed, without anyone saying it clearly, that what you have determines something important about who you are, and suddenly, the new car your colleague just bought isn't just a car. It's a signal that gets processed somewhere old and fast, and not particularly rational. And the financial decision that follows, the one that arrives with its justification already attached, isn't really about the car. It never was. It's about managing a feeling that predates the car by decades. We tend to call this keeping up with the Joneses, like it's vanity, like it's a simple social competition that people with enough self-awareness should be able to rise above. But that framing misses almost everything important about it. For most people, it isn't vanity at all. It's the exhausting, often unconscious work of trying to outrun an inherited story about what their financial position says about their value as a human being. And the painful irony is this: the more urgently someone needs to close the gap, the wider the actual gap becomes. The more they spend to project stability, the less stable they are. And the distance between what they're projecting and what's actually true creates its own particular kind of weight. A performance that doesn't end, a version of themselves they have to maintain. Thomas Stanley spent decades studying how wealth actually accumulates in America. What he found, consistently, was this. The people who looked the most wealthy were frequently the least wealthy, and the people who had quietly built genuine security were often invisible. No signals, no performance, nothing to prove, because at some point, they stopped needing to prove it. But let's not move past that too quickly, because stopping the performance, detaching your sense of self from what your financial choices signal to other people, is not a simple insight that changes everything once you've heard it. It requires something most financial advice never actually asks for. It requires recognizing that the performance was happening in the first place. And that recognition is harder than it sounds, because the attachment doesn't feel like an attachment. It feels like wanting a decent life. It feels like not wanting to fall behind. It feels like the completely reasonable desire to not feel worse about yourself than you felt yesterday. It doesn't feel like the inheritance of someone else's unresolved fear. But very often, that's exactly what it is. Think about the child who watched a parent work constantly and still feel like it was never quite enough. What did they actually learn from that? On the surface, maybe the value of hard work. But underneath, something else. That effort doesn't guarantee safety. That financial security can feel like something that's always slightly out of reach, even when you're doing everything right. That the ground beneath you is less solid than it appears. And that learning, absorbed young, never examined, shapes things quietly and comprehensively. Maybe they undercharge for their work, because asking for what they're worth feels like it invites rejection. Maybe they hold back in negotiations, because the emotional stakes feel far heavier than the conversation in front of them. Maybe they step back from opportunities that carry real financial risk. Not because the math doesn't work, but because something older than math is running the decision. None of these are logical responses to the present, but they're deeply understandable responses to the past. And they're far more common than most people realize. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Family and Economic Issues found that how families communicate about money, how they model it, avoid it, argue about it, or refuse to mention it at all, was among the strongest predictors of adult financial behavior. Stronger than income, stronger than education, the financial messages you received in childhood, particularly the ones that were never spoken, only felt, are still present in your decision-making today. The question isn't whether the pattern is there. The question is whether you've ever looked at it directly, because there's a difference between knowing something and actually seeing it. You can understand intellectually that your family had a complicated relationship with money. You can trace the origin of a pattern clearly, explain it articulately, even feel genuine compassion for it, and still carry every bit of its weight. Because the pattern doesn't live in your understanding of it. It lives in the moment before the decision, in the feeling that arrives before your rational mind has fully formed the question, in the choice that happens so quickly, it barely registers as a choice at all. That's what makes this genuinely difficult. Not understanding, the space between understanding and changing. There's a particular kind of discomfort that arrives when you actually see your own pattern. Not patterns in general. Your specific one. The precise shape it takes in your life. The decisions it quietly influences. The feelings it reliably produces. It's uncomfortable because it requires holding two things at once. Real compassion for where the pattern came from, and honest acknowledgement of what it's been costing you. Most people lean hard toward one or the other. Some trace the pattern back to its origin and stay there. The story of where it came from becomes a place to live rather than a place to pass through. Others acknowledge it briefly and rush toward correction. I'm an adult. I understand this now. I just need to do better. But that rush past the emotional truth is its own kind of avoidance. You can't meaningfully move away from something you haven't been willing to fully face. The research here is actually straightforward. Awareness changes behavior. Not completely, not immediately, but measurably and consistently. Behavioral economist Shlomo Benartzi found that making people more emotionally connected to their future selves. Through reflection, through imagination, through any method that made the future feel real rather than abstract, significantly changed their present financial decisions. Not because they learned something new, but because something shifted emotionally, which has been the point all along. This was never a knowledge problem. It's an emotional relationship problem, and emotional relationships change slowly, through honest attention, through new experiences that gradually, quietly, contradict the old story. So what does that actually look like? Not as a system, not as a set of steps to follow, just as a real human process. It starts with noticing, not fixing, not judging, just pausing long enough to ask what was happening inside you just before a financial decision formed, not what triggered it from the outside. What you were feeling on the inside: anxiety, the low hum of inadequacy, the vague pressure of falling behind something you can't quite name. When you feel resistance to spending on something that genuinely matters to you, a real investment in your health, your growth, your future. Notice what that resistance actually feels like. Where does it live? What voice does it carry? And more importantly, whose voice is that, really? Alongside that noticing, there's the slower work of building a more honest story. Not a better feeling one, not optimism assembled over unexamined ground. An honest one. One that says, this is where this came from. This is what it was protecting me from. And this is what I actually want now. For some people, that work happens in conversation, with someone who understands the intersection of psychology and financial behavior, with a financial planner who asks about the feelings, not just the figures. For others, it's the quiet practice of tracking not just spending, but the emotional state that preceded it, building a more accurate record of what's actually driving things. For others still, it's simply finding people willing to talk about money honestly, without the performance, without the comparison, just real conversation about something that touches everyone's life, and almost no one discusses openly. What it rarely looks like is a turning point. And that's worth saying clearly, because we tend to be drawn to the dramatic version, the moment someone saw the truth, and everything changed. That story is compelling. It's also not usually how it works. Real change in financial psychology is slow, non-linear. There are setbacks that feel like failure, but are actually just part of the process. There are moments of quiet progress that don't look like anything from the outside. It looks like making a slightly different decision than you would have made last year. And then, making it again, and noticing over time that the pull of the old pattern has softened slightly. Not gone, softened. That's the actual shape of change. And it matters more in the long run than any dramatic story of transformation. Because here's what sits underneath all of this. The pattern you inherited, whatever form it takes in your life, was not a mistake. It was a response. Your family developed their relationship with money inside real circumstances. Real fear, real scarcity, real uncertainty that nobody chose and nobody fully escaped. And the behaviors that grew out of those circumstances were, in their own way, adaptive. They made sense for that life, for that level of exposure, for that particular emotional reality. You just inherited those adaptations for a different life. A life with different pressures, different possibilities, different emotional terrain. And the work of recognizing that, of separating what you inherited from what you actually need now, that is the most foundational financial work there is. Quiet, unglamorous, rarely discussed, but foundational, because you can get every external thing right. The right accounts, the right habits, the right numbers on the right spreadsheet. And if the emotional architecture underneath those decisions is still running on an old map, the numbers will keep telling one story while your behavior tells another. The work isn't in the spreadsheet. It never was. It's in the honest, patient examination of the story you were handed before you were old enough to question it, and the slow, deliberate process of deciding what belongs to you, and what you're finally ready to put down. If something in this sat with you, a pattern you recognized, a feeling you've carried without ever quite naming it, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Not because it's easy to talk about, but because these are the conversations that actually mean something. And if this is the kind of thinking you want to keep returning to, the psychology underneath financial life, not just the mechanics of it, this is where that conversation lives. We'll see you in the next one.